Let's ask if Western civilization is dying. So, Oswald Spengler proposed, following Goethe, that civilizations have life cycles. Civilizations originate, they are in an early gestation period, they spring into their youth, they expand, they reach a certain height, they reach a certain maturity, and they begin to contract, to spasm, and eventually to fall into sickness and ill health and eventually die. And this is the life cycle of civilizations. And then all collective groups exist within this semi-deterministic life cycle, in the same way that you and I, we don't have a choice of whether we live or die. We have a certain clock. Some of us will live to be 70, some of us will live to be 120, but no one's going to live to be 200, at least not with the current technology that is available and accessible to the common person. Maybe that'll change, but just assuming in Spengler's time, people lived to be maybe 120 if you were exceptional, maybe 100 if you were extraordinary, maybe 90 if you were above average, and 80, and so on and so forth. This is how old people live to be, right? A century, give or take a few decades, right? That's all you can expect. And so Spengler's idea is that basically civilizations follow the same sort of schema, with about something like a 700-year cycle. And maybe I'm off a few hundred years. It doesn't really matter, right? It's on the order of 1,000 years. That the Roman Republic started in about 700 BC and ended in about 300 AD, give or take a few hundred years. That medieval civilization started in about 300 AD and ended at about 1300 AD. That Faustian civilization began in about 1300 AD and it's ending in the 21st century, right? So this is his idea, and it makes some kind of intuitive sense, right? It creates these analogous structures where we say, a civilization is like a person has a certain lifespan, a civilization has a certain lifespan. And so it just kind of intuitively makes sense. But I don't think that, as neat as it is, and I think we should investigate it and look at the evidence and learn about the things Spengler's talking about, because he is, in some ways, revolutionary as an intellectual in his theory of civilizations, and that he really creates a comparative sociology of civilizations that you don't quite see put forth before then. He actually has a remarkable relativism about him, in that he's willing to kind of look at civilizations on their own merit, by their own merit, not judge them according to like a Judeo-Christian conception of a linear teleology. The thing is, it is real in itself. Its values are self-referentially legitimate, and let's just analyze the way that it came into being and the way that it died. But I guess I have a more Judeo-Christian view of things, in the sense that I think that this isolated view of culture and this biological view of culture, which Spengler at the same time had a very anti-Darwinistic, anti-materialistic view of blood and biology, similar to Goethe, in fact. But nonetheless, I think this strict view of culture and civilization, that there are these separate entities, I don't think it's quite as cut and dry in that. Clearly, individual biological entities have a lifespan, and there's really no way around that. You can't say that, unless you believe in reincarnation, you can't say that like one person like sort of dies, but they actually just like their soul leaves their body and inhabits another body or something like that. Whereas with cultures, it's a little bit more abstract. And, there's something recorded in ancient Greek that I think it may have been in Plato's dialogues or elsewhere that, a Greek goes to an Egyptian and the Egyptian says to the Greek, you Greeks are very young because you don't remember your history. And there's a concept there that the Greeks, in comparison to other peoples of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, don't have a good concept of history, that their history goes back to maybe Homer, and that maybe they're vaguely aware of Atlantis and these ancient happenings, but that the other people surrounding them have a much longer view of history and a much longer understanding of the rise and fall of kingdoms and civilizations. And so, from my perspective, if such a thing is possible, and I do think it is possible, then there would exist classes of people who have an understanding of the rise and fall of civilizations, who in that sense would stand above the rise and fall of those civilizations and would view the rise and fall of those civilizations in the same way we view the rise and fall of certain companies like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, right? If Coca-Cola goes bankrupt tomorrow, Pepsi can, buy up the stocks and take over Coca-Cola and merge the brands or something like that. Like, the rise and fall of companies is not significant. And to that same token, on a grand historical scale, the rise and fall of civilizations and of countries and of nations is not significant on that scale. Right now, of course, the people working at Coca-Cola, they're going to feel that this is disastrous, right? They've lost their jobs, they've lost their pensions, everything's terrible. And I'm not discounting that on the individual level, but I'm saying that on a world historical level, the fall of Coca-Cola would not be disastrous. The fall of America would not necessarily be disastrous. Although I'm not predicting the fall of America here, my opinion has been for a long time that America is not going to fall anytime soon, that in fact America seems to be becoming more powerful. And if we look at the Roman example, the Republican form of government has not truly been disrupted yet. We have not truly broken with our Constitution. I think we have a long way to go until we break fully and explicitly with our Constitution. I do think that will come at some point, perhaps in the near future. And I think when it does happen, we have to look at Julius Caesar and say that, when he converted the empire from a republic to, he converted Rome from a republic to an empire, he in many ways kept the vestiges of republicanism. And he said, we're still going to have a Senate, right? We're still going to have some traditional, in fact, he presented himself in many ways as the restorer of the republic. Now, what he did was he stacked the Senate with his Gallic allies. And he made this, so he stacked the Senate with foreigners. Julius Caesar was in favor of mass immigration and cultural mixing, much like his predecessor, his ancient predecessor, Alexander the Great. He was in favor of race mixing, I suppose. And so he stacked the court, so to speak. We haven't quite reached that point. We haven't quite reached that type of constitutional crisis. A lot of Southerners would have you believe that somehow Abraham Lincoln was that's kind of a laudatory term to give someone the American Caesar, but a lot of Southern secessionists would tell you that we really destroyed the Constitution with Abraham Lincoln and that he converted us. Or someone would say, well, no, it's the Federal Reserve with Woodrow Wilson or something else like that. Maybe it was FDR packing the court that really turned it over. Or no, it was George W. Bush with the fact that the NSA and the Patriot Act and the spying. Or no, it was Obama with his executive orders, or is Trump with January 6th. Like, there's so many different quote-unquote Rubicons. But I think when it happens, we'll know, right? When it actually happens, we'll know, right? There won't be any dispute. There won't be any sort of, I mean, we'll be dealing with, frankly, we'll be dealing with a new religious system at that point. The current religious system, which has ruled America, has been this liberalism, right? And I think liberalism is a diverse and dynamic system that basically means it is the evolution of Christianity out of strictly Christological theory. That is, Christianity has as its center figure Jesus Christ. Liberalism does not have a central figure as such. It has a constellation. It basically takes many of the concepts of Christianity and encodes them in a different framing. You have the concept of rights, and you have the concept of individualism, and you have the concept of freedom, and you have all these things that I think have Christian roots, but that they're codified into a constellation, and you're constantly balancing, what is the right distribution of rights and freedoms, and, your right ends where my freedom begins, and blah, blah, blah. Right, that's what liberalism is, and there's obviously different ways to represent it, but that is kind of our state religion, the Constitution, the Founding Fathers. And we can see how this is vulnerable, and we can see how this could give way to something else. And if it did, it would bring with it a new religiousness, a second religiousness, is what Spangler called it. And so I think Spangler has good analysis there of like what happens when nations fall and countries fall. Like, what does that process look like? But on another level, the way in which Spangler presents all of this is this kind of like biological determinism, that there's a certain lifespan and you're just fated to follow along with this, and you have to be like the Roman soldier guarding his post at Vesuvius when the volcano erupts. I don't think that way at all. And I think that, history there are cyclical tendencies that people are bred into. We have a circadian rhythm as individuals and as group. I believe there's such a thing as a group circadian rhythm. I think it's proven that women in groups will menstruate together. I think this is a scientific fact. And so I think there are these sort of, you could almost call them epigenetic or, morphic resonance, whatever label you want to give it. Like, that obviously does exist for the mass man, but I think there are people who are able to rise above that, or at least see something above it, right? You can still participate in that as a human being, but you can kind of have a perspective which is above this type of animalistic, animal magnetism, mass mind, flock herd mentality. You can rise above that and you can say, okay, well, there were these ancient civilizations, they rose and fell. We can have knowledge of them. We can build upon what they built. And even if the mass man has forgotten, the mass man doesn't remember what happened 30 years ago, let alone what happened in ancient Greece. But if you can rise above that and you can remember those things as an individual, and you can be part of small groups that remember that, I think that is the one of the laudatory aspects of Judaism, is that Judaism has a long memory, and Judaism emphasizes the importance of events that happened 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, right? Let alone 6,000 years ago. It states that these things are important, and they're more important than the day-to-day politics, which for the average American citizen, I think they have mostly forgotten the events of yesteryear, or they want to modernize those things and say, forget. They want to redefine, early Christian culture in some kind of, modern day. Oh, well, Jesus, I've seen this thing where people, and I guess you could argue the reverse. People could say that, like, Jesus is inherently like a Black Lives Matter supporter. But, I think whatever you think about, like, some kind of teleology of Christianity as like this, this radical anti-racist ideology. I mean, people can believe that. That's fine. Obviously, the words of Paul speak for themselves. But what I'm saying, at least in the practice of it, is rather than trying to go back to the roots of Christianity and create an oppositional defiance and say, well, we're not like the world, Christianity is radically different. Instead, what Christianity seems to do is it seems to, in the mainstream, it seems to like ask, what is the big story of the day? Okay, it's BLM. Okay, well, Jesus would have supported BLM, right? So there's two completely different perspectives. One where you're saying, I have this ancient perspective and I'm going to change the modern world to fit my perspective, or I'm going to stand against the modern world to fit my ancient perspective. That there's a struggle there versus, okay, what's the hot news item? Let's somehow shoehorn Jesus into that. I see a lot of that, of course. I've mentioned this before with nationalism. I feel that figures like Viktor Orban, people like Trump, people like Vladimir Putin are used as evidence of a nationalist revival in the greater Western world, when in material reality all these figures are serving the opposite purpose. In terms of what did Trump actually accomplish in 4 years, he made the Republican Party less ethnically cohesive. He increased mass immigration. He made the Republican Party more LGBTQ friendly. What has Viktor Orban done? He's increased the strength of the ties between Hungary and the European Union. What has Vladimir Putin done? He has reversed Soviet-era policies which have restricted the freedom of movement of the 10% of Russia that is Muslim, and you can say that's insignificant, but of course, the same people who praise Vladimir Putin are going to turn around and say, France and Sweden are hellholes, and England is doomed to cuck state because they've allowed all this mass immigration in their country. Well, Vladimir Putin has done the same thing with the CIS, the what is it called, the something of independent states council committee. I forget what the C stands for, but anyway, the CIS. He's allowed for that freedom of movement and overseen a demographic decline in Russia. He's built all of these empty churches, right? So there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of appeals to a dying ideology. So I see Christianity doing that. I see nationalism doing that. But I don't think that this is the right way to go. And I think that, like, for me, when I conceive of a dying Western civilization, I say, like, okay, in some sense, I see where people are coming from. I see how people can look at the world and say that's happening. But on the other hand, I think that's so superficial. I think what's actually happening is we're on the cusp of, creating new species and new races of people. And the technology is already here and the capacity is already here for monumental change. And the death that we're seeing right now is not a natural organic death, but in every sense, it is a question of a rug being pulled from out under your feet. That for thousands of years, peasants were forced into churches where they were taught family values. For thousands of years, peasants were forced into conditions where they were instructed in a certain moral code, in a certain religious ritual. And they were informed, that Zeus is the chief of the gods and he is the model of the patriarch and so on and so forth. And so there were Jungian archetypes that were presented strategically, whether consciously or unconsciously, that these were created and molded over time through different cultures to instruct the peasantry in the right way to live and the right way to be. And when all of that is, you don't even have to attack it, you just have to stop defending it. And the moment that you stop defending that, the moment you stop promoting that, forcing people to believe that, is the moment that it sort of all dissipates because all of these memes, all of these beliefs, none of them are natural, none of them are self-sustaining. Marriage is not self-sustaining. Like, this is something on the right wing. They say, well, we just believe what's natural. We believe in tribalism and the in-group, and we believe in conservatism and the nuclear family. It's like none of these things are natural. None of these things are encoded in the DNA. Especially when you have a mass society, you have to consider epigenetic factors. You have to consider that the incentive structures of a small tribe in a state of nature are very different from the incentive structures in a mass urbanized, suburbanized society where everything's connected by the internet. The psychological, emotional incentives are very different. The way that we view sexuality is different. The way that we view alienation, human relationships is different. Our sense of architecture, the natural world, the way that we interact with food, the way that we are trapped in addiction cycles. Like, there's so much that is different, that to say, like, well, we just advocate for what's natural. Well, sure, you advocate for what was natural in the Stone Age in some sense. That's not even true technically, because you look at Africa, and Africa doesn't have these quote-unquote natural structures. These structures were invented by priests. These structures of morality that you think are so firmly encoded in the DNA clearly are not, because when you remove the priestly instruction from people within a single generation, they completely fall into what you call deviancy, but is actually, in a sense, normalcy, right? The normal state of being is entropy. The normal state of being is to, follow whatever your hedonistic emotions tell you to do. And so that, to me, is the only, when people talk about the bedrock of human nature, it's something very Freudian. It's something primal. It's something selfish. It's something hedonistic. It is simply following your passions, and you don't get, the family structure out of that. You don't get Christianity out of that. You don't get nationalism or conservatism or caring about these abstract ideals or concepts of chivalry or heroism, right? All those things need to be instilled and built and were developed over thousands of years consciously by priestly elites who were basically trying to design societies and religious structures that would, support their goals. And part of some of those people involved with that may have been inspired intuitively and others analytically. But yeah, I don't think we're merely degenerating. I think the people who have made the decisions at the top to remove the support for all of these structures that were enshrined in law, that promoted, this definition of free speech, that, like, it's just a complete revolution in terms of what is offensive and what is obscene, a complete reorientation. And the elite just doesn't care anymore, because the elite has regarded people as farm animals. And, if you have a robot that can replace your farm animal, then you don't have any reason to feed the farm animal. You have to conceive of Christian morality as a type of hay that the farmer has to gather up and sort of feed to the cows. And once they become regulated in that feeding process, they come to expect it, and they come to see the hay as a regular, spontaneous phenomenon, that bales of hay just appear and they go and eat it, and it's the most natural thing in the world to them. And they think that's just part of the natural ecology of things, not realizing it's the farmer who's putting out the hay for them. He's putting the water in the trough, right? And so all of that's been taken away. Now the cows are starving, they're diseased, they're dying, and people like Spangler have come up with this theory that, the reason why the common man is completely infertile and the common man is self-destructive and suicidal is because the common man is subject to this anonymous force of history where things just degenerate. It's just part of the cycle of life. Which is taking away the agency here of the societal administrators who call the shots and make the decisions and decide what is moral and what is not, decide what is free speech and what is offensive and what is obscene. that there were key decisions that were made that were not spontaneous, that were a result of a shift in incentives and a shift in the way of perceiving the common man as an industrial workhorse versus the common man as a Malthusian problem, the common man as, an inconvenience, something to be dealt with, something that's dangerous that could be utilized for some kind of, fascistic or communistic, populist, nationalist, socialist kind of disruption. And that's very costly economically, that, it leads to world wars where, the capitalist powers still win, but it's a little bit spooky there for a moment. And some of them, of course, profit off of that, but some of them dislike it. And, the priest class reorients itself away from trying to farm people, trying to feed them family values and develop them into good workhorses for an agricultural or an industrial society, and then starts to look at people as, for their carbon footprint alone, because what do these people actually produce? They produce iPhones, and what's the purpose of an iPhone? To entertain. Okay, they produce Netflix series. What's the purpose of Netflix? To entertain these people. They produce pornography. What's the purpose of pornography? They produce drugs. What's the purpose of drugs? It's just to create momentary hedonistic entertainment and feels for a massive population who are not creative, who are not inventive, who are not doing productive labor anymore, because all the productive labor is already or soon will be replaced by automation and robotics and artificial intelligence. It's already happening. The people who doubt it, I mean, you've seen a Tesla driving down the street, right? Unless you're on several levels of conspiracy theory above what I've ever seen, Teslas are real. They're driving around in the streets. They're not fake. They're not a conspiracy. It's not a hologram. Robots are taking your driving jobs, and driving jobs account for, if you look at Uber, you look at Uber Eats, you look at trucking, you look at, this is a vast portion of the quote-unquote unskilled or less than college-educated workforce. And, so when all those jobs are already or soon to be automated, it's like, what do these people exist to do? They exist to pleasure and entertain themselves. And in the past, they would produce industrial widgets that would be useful to the elite in terms of war machines, war-making capacity, or they would produce, they could be cannon fodder, or they could work on a farm or something. But the fact is that the amount of energy that it takes to feed a human being so they can work on a farm, or the amount of energy it takes to feed a human being so they can fight in a war, it's quickly becoming a losing calculation when you look at drone warfare and you look at industrialized farming, automated farming. So these people now just sort of exist to entertain each other. And when you look at this situation from a Malthusian societal administrative standpoint, it's kind of like you've got a disgusting group of people who are engaged in a form of mutual masturbation, and they're not really moving humanity forward, and they're entirely selfish, and they don't have any capacity to develop value in themselves. They're just sort of, and it's this self-confirmation process where you remove morality from these people and you watch how far they plummet. And, it's just true. The idea that, like, the common man, like the farmer, is, he's close to the soil and he's self-regulating and he's in tune with nature and he's a moral person by his nature. Is some of that true? Maybe. But, removed from that environment, in the suburban urban environment, in the internet environment, how do people act? People act as a predictable mass, selfish, self-destructive, hurting themselves, hurting other people, increasingly so. And so, like, this is this feedback loop where you remove public morality because it's no longer needed. and then you watch how people act, and you say, these people are terrible, we need to get rid of them. And so you remove more public morality so that people have less and less children, and then you see worse and worse behavior. And so it's just kind of like this feedback loop where the people who are in charge are disgusted by the masses of humanity who they've kind of left to the wayside. And the more and more that they're disgusted, the more and more they feel incentivized to destroy the population, and the more and more, therefore, that they want to remove all of these structures of life that allow the population to sustain itself. And so they're actively undermining any stable structure that allows for people to reproduce and live and want to live, right? And so you remove all these structures of meaning in people's lives, religion primarily, and you replace it with, Freudian emotionalist fluff, what higher minds call superficial, and it goes down and down and down like that. And so you can be a Spanglerian and you can say, well, this is a natural process and this is the way things are meant to be, and I guess you've got nothing to do but support, Trump and Putin and Viktor Orban. But there's a minoritarian perspective that understands why this is happening and says, I'm not going to go down with the ship. I'm not going to be the soldier at Vesuvius. I'm not going to just say, oh, yeah, I guess we have to die fighting. We have to go down fighting. In that sense, you say, okay, I understand what's going on, and I'm not a reactionary. I'm not filled with resentment. I'm not here to dissent against this process. I recognize this process, and what I want to do is I want to go to the island. I want to find the lifeboat. I want to be part of the remnant of humanity in some sense that does its best to survive and recognize what's going on. And I think that, to a great degree, is the origin of Judaism, and I think that's the origin of Christianity. And, obviously these things change over time, but that's the attempt, that's the perspective. I think that's necessary. So thanks for listening. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Nice. Subscribe. Very good.
Nice. Beautiful.
Very good.
Beautiful. You're going to love it. If you love autism, you're going to love my channel. Okay, great.
All right.